So, hello everyone, and welcome to today's session. My name is Karina Rackett. I'm the Executive Director at BIC and your host for this, the very first in our brand new series of BIC Brunches, the Thema sessions, which on this occasion is all about the adult fiction category. So why the new series? Well, at the end of, some of you may already know this, at the end of February this year, we announced that the BIC Standard Subject Category Scheme, or BIC codes as it's more commonly known, will be made obsolete by the end of February 2024. So this series of Thema sessions then will run from now until at least February 2024 to help support the industry through this transition. So at the moment we have, you can find more about the announcement in the press release via the link on your screen there. We have additional BIC Brunch Thema sessions lined up throughout the course of the year, and going into 2023, there will be more to come after January. So we have sessions on diversity, children and education, popular non-fiction, academic non-fiction, and then comics and manga. We also have, in April, we'll have a guided tour of what's new in Thema version 1.5, and that will be on the 28th of April, just following the release of that version. So if you're interested in any of those events or any of our, even any of our events, including our training, not just these sessions, but in particular these sessions, please do have a look at the link there on Eventbrite, where you can see everything that we're doing. Don't worry about writing down these links. I appreciate that they're quite long. We will be sharing the slides later on, and you'll be able to make a note of them that way. So just some housekeeping before we get started. If you have questions for speakers, there will be a dedicated speaker session at the end, sorry, a dedicated question and answer session at the end after the speakers have all finished presenting. And just to let you know, this event is being recorded so that we can use it in our marketing and promotional activities, and also to make the session available to people that weren't able to attend today. And just to let you know that attendees won't be identified in the recording. So if you have questions, just put them into the question box. We won't identify you. And finally, just to say that BIC is a neutral membership organisation, and as such we politely ask that both our speakers and our attendees strictly avoid any comments or conversations or questions that may be considered commercially sensitive or anti-competitive. So without further ado, here's the running order. So I'm doing the introduction now, and then we will hand over to Chris Sainer, Standards Editor at EDItEUR. And following Chris, we will be going over to Marisa Davis, Metadata Manager at Pan Macmillan, who's going to talk about Thema from a publisher's perspective. And then we will move over to Neela Ahrens and Dr. Detlef Bauer, Product Management, Metadata and Search at Libri. And they're going to talk to us about how Thema can be adapted and implemented to booksellers' specifications to help their customers' needs and requirements. We'll then go into a question and answer session, and we should be wrapping up the session by 1:30. So very quickly, for those of you on the call who may not know who we are, we're a UK-based, not-for-profit members organisation at the heart of the book industry in the UK, creating standards, best practice and resources that form part of the DNA of your supply chains. We're helping your organisations become more efficient, save money, become less wasteful, and hopefully ultimately greener. We hold a unique position of trust, facilitating UK and international industry-wide collaboration to reach agreement on dependable standards and best practice in the supply chain. And we do this in a variety of ways, including running 5 strategic committees focused on metadata, physical supply chain, digital supply chain, and the green supply chains, and also the library sector. We offer training, events and workshops and execute supply chain related projects for and on behalf of our membership, but also the wider book industry in general. We also operate 3 industry recognised accreditation schemes, and you can find out more about everything we do on our website there. So back to today's session. As you can imagine, there's a lot to cover off. So without further ado, I'm going to now hand you straight over to Chris. Chris Stainer, Standards Editor at EDItEUR. EDItEUR are the organisation that manages and governs the standard Thema. And Chris is going to give us an introduction to the scheme, its principles, its structure, its history, and some worked examples looking at the adult fiction category. So I'm just going to hand my screen over to Chris now, so bear with me. There we go. Chris, you should have the screen.
You should all see my, hello everyone, should be seeing my screen now.
Yes, can see your screen.
Thank you, Karina. So welcome everybody to this first of the Thema brunches. So just a quick introduction to EDItEUR, if there are any of you on this webinar who don't know who we are. So EDItEUR is a small not-for-profit membership organisation based in London, but whose principal role is to create, support and promote standards, metadata standards in the global book supply industry. So the one many of you will be familiar with, Onyx for Books, but Thema is another of our standards. So that is why I'm going to be talking to you about Thema. So for those of you who may not be so familiar with Thema, a quick overview of what it is. So Thema is an international, multilingual book subject classification scheme. It was designed from the beginning to meet the diverse needs of publishers, of retailers, and of trade intermediaries, so data aggregators, wholesalers, distributors, anybody who needs to use book subject classification in some way. It's designed for the whole of the global book industry, so it should work for trade, for children's, for educational, for STM publishers, etc. It's also designed to be used with the book in all its manifestations, so that could be a physical book or a digital book, it could be an audio book. It can also be used for some of the alternative products that we find in the book supply chain as well. It's also suitable to use for online selling and also for in-person selling. It's suitable if you only are aiming your classifications at a domestic market, and it's also suitable if you are looking at more international usage. The point of Thema is it's there as a standard to help merchandising of titles and therefore help the discoverability and, importantly, converting those the titles that once they've been discovered, converting those to sales. It does this by creating a clear standard that can be used in the global metadata supply chain to give clear information. Thema was created and is maintained and updated by real users. So it tries to address real world problems, real world issues in the book supply chain. Thema positively encourages a post-coordinated approach. So this facilitates filtered or faceted searching. It's also an international standard available to everyone to use, so that levels the playing field in many ways, gives an equal voice to everyone. Just going to give an overview of the structure of Thema for those of you who are not familiar with it. So Thema now has about 3,000 core subject categories, and these are arranged hierarchically in 20 main sections. There's a variable depth inside that hierarchy depending on the type of topic that's covered. There's also about 1,000 shared qualifiers in 6 sections. And within those qualifiers, there are about 4,000 what we call national extension qualifiers. National extension qualifiers are an extra level of detail that can be added at the request of national groups when there's subjects or topics that are particularly relevant in a particular market. But those national qualifiers are there for anybody to use if they so wish. Most of those national extensions are found in the place qualifiers, and I would say the second biggest amount of national qualifiers are in the educational purpose qualifiers. Now, the important thing about qualifiers is they are to be used with subject categories to give greater meaning. So Thema, all of these categories, subject categories, all these qualifiers have a language independent code. Then a heading and notes. And those heading and notes can be in multiple languages. So if we take the code FR, FR is the bit of information that you will exchange with other people. It's what you put in your metadata, it's what you put in your Onyx, it's what you put on your Excel, it's what you fill in. That's the code, that's the important bit of Thema for the exchange of information. Now in the English version, we've said FR corresponds to the concept of romance. So we called it romance, but we could have called it romantic fiction, romance novels. We could have used another term. So we've got it in English. The German language group has also given a standard translation for that. There's a standard translation into Spanish. There's a standard translation into Ukrainian. There's a standard translation into Arab. And there's a standard translation into Japanese. All those translations mean the same thing. They're all saying FR means this concept of romance. So this is an overview of the top level of Thema, as you'd see it on the Thema code browser. As you can see, all the subjects start with the letter, all the qualifiers start with a number. All these top level codes are there simply so that we can build the rest of the hierarchy on them. These aren't the codes you'd be using. So if we take a look at fiction, so this is looking at fiction and all the second level fiction codes. These are the codes that you'll start using if you're classifying books. So here you can see we have different types of fiction, different genre. If you look at the browser, you'll notice some of them have ... after them. That means there are subcodes. If there are none, that means this is the last of the codes in this particular branch of the hierarchy. So let's dive into romance. So within the romance hierarchy, we also have other codes for particularly important subgenres of romance. What's important to remember here is for example, if you choose to classify something as it's romance time travel, FRU, if you're assigning the FRU code, you do not and should not assign either the FR or the F code. You never in a hierarchical system assign the parent codes, because anybody who's receiving that knows it's got FR as part of the code and F is part of the code. So you don't need to assign that extra bit of information. If I click on all the asterisks, it opens up all the notes. And in Thema, notes serve two purposes. There's guidance notes, usage notes. So we might say it's particularly suitable to use this type of qualifier with this type of code, or maybe mix this code with this code. But we also put in notes to give more guidance on the concept of that code. So for example, if you look at FRT here, romance, fantasy and paranormal, we have things like class here, vampire romance. So if you're working at a publisher, you've published something and you're told it's vampire romance, we've given you, this is the code you should be using. We obviously don't have a category called vampire romance because there are various subgenres of fantasy romance that could have codes, but we don't, because that would be too much detail. So we'll give you some guidance. This is included in here. It means if a retailer receives that, if they, for example, if they're really specialized in fantasy and they want to create a vampire romance section on their website or in their shop, they know they need to look for the FRT code. They'd also probably look for a non-fiction code VXQM2, which is mythical creatures, vampires, werewolves, etc., which will give that extra level of detail. If you were looking for something like BIT-lit, which is another expression for vampire literature, the search tool will guide you towards FRT so that you find the right code. Another thing within the fiction section, there are two hierarchies that give you some extra codes to add extra information. So one of them is this FY hierarchy, which says here's some special features that you might want to describe that are commonly used in different parts of the market. So you might want to say it's a collection of short stories, or it's translated fiction. The second of this special selection of codes is FX, narrative themes. Narrative themes are almost like special qualifiers for fiction. They can be applied to any fiction code. Indeed, they can be used with poetry, drama, and literature as well. But their primary purpose was to give opportunity to give greater definition to general fiction codes. Those broad areas where there is a lot of publication, but there's very little sub-detail. So this is a way of saying, for example, you could choose FXD. I'm publishing a novel about the relationship between three siblings. That's the primary theme of my novel, so I could use FXD. Obviously, a narrative theme like FXD, love and relationships, you would never use it with romance, because the very nature of romantic fiction is there's love and a relationship. Another thing you may notice within the fiction, we have some headings like contemporary lifestyle fiction. Contemporary lifestyle fiction is quite a neutral term. It's chosen because it's hard to find the right term for this. It has to be understandable across the world. A retailer could find a much more exciting local term to use for this, but you'll notice within the notes, we try and give you some guidance of the kind of thing that you might put in this area. So romantic comedy, feel-good fiction, uplit, slice of life fiction, etc. And just to illustrate some of the things that we have to do when we're updating, so a lot of questions have come in about what does contemporary lifestyle fiction. So in version 1.5, we greatly expanded the note to try and explain more what this concept of FQ, contemporary lifestyle fiction, means. And that's all those changes should be coming out at the end of April. So I mentioned post-coordination. So just a quick, simple overview. Two main types of classification: pre-coordinated, post-coordinated. If some of you are familiar with the scheme used in the United States of America, the BIC codes, BIC is a pre-coordinated scheme. That code, FIC 022020, fiction, mystery, detective, police, procedural, that's the code, it's predefined. You could send a second BIC code, but the sending of that second BIC code doesn't give any enhanced detail. All it does is basically say you could put it on this shelf or this shelf. The two together have no meaning. Code systems like the old BIC subject scheme, and to a far greater extent Thema, also have this concept. We define the code, so FFP means crime and mystery, police, procedural, but also if you send that with other codes, you give the possibility for people to receive that to define it, give greater meaning. So this book I could stick in my crime fiction area, but maybe on my website or within the bookshop itself, I could then say, show me all the crime fiction that's translated. Show me all the crime fiction that takes place in the 1960s. Show me all the crime fiction that takes place in Sweden or in parts of Sweden. Or show me all the crime fiction that takes place in the 1960s in Sweden. So we've got these endless possibilities. It also means that somebody who's got a bookshop, either online or in person, could create a Nordic noir section, or a Scandinavian noir section, or Scandinavian fiction section, or create a translated fiction. All of those are possible because they have that extra level of detail in Thema. So I took this title as well. I found this interview with the author. The author is talking about classification of his book, and that's very important. All of those of you who are in publishing know that authors often have very strong opinions about how their books should be classified, and it's a legitimate conversation. But what's interesting when you compare Thema with something like a pre-coordinated scheme like BIC, with Thema, you would obviously put this in the modern and contemporary fiction. That would be your main subject. That will be what you'd say. If you're not putting it anywhere else, put it in this. If you use a pre-coordinated scheme, BIC, for example, has a fiction code LGBTQ plus gay. You'd have to make a choice. Do I stick it in that, With Thema, what you do is you send qualifiers. So we have a qualifier 5PSG relating to gay people. So you could send that. That gives people the option. I could create a filtered search. I'm looking for books specifically about gay men, or you could use the 5PS parent code, LGBTQ, to add things. You could add a place qualifier, Middle East. Even though this doesn't take place in a real country, it still takes place in the Middle East, and it's about the Middle East. So you could put a place qualifier. So anybody who was looking to fiction that takes place in the Middle East, you've given them that extra level of detail. And also we could put in some narrative themes so that anybody who's trying to, I'm looking for fiction that deals with politics. This does. I'm looking for fiction that deals with identity. This does. I'm looking for fiction that deals with relationships. This does. So you're giving lots of different ways for a reseller to, or a potential buyer or reader to find these books. And I can use those qualifiers. So another book that's classified mainly as principally as modern and contemporary fiction. Again, I could add the qualifier 5PSG, that gives that extra level of detail. So we can find that book. But again, I'm going to add more detail. So I'm going to give it a narrative theme, migration, and fiction in translation. I'm going to give some information about where the action of the novel takes place. It takes place between Kosovo and Helsinki. I can give some information about when does the action take place. So part of it takes place in the 1980s. Part of it takes place in the early part of the last decade. So I've got that level of information. I've given people extra information. And then I can put in, which is permitted in Thema, I can use a non-fiction code because this non-fiction code corresponds to one of the major themes of this title, coping with solitude, coping with loneliness. And I've been very clear in my data because I've said very clearly this is a novel by using main subject. And also if somebody was looking for non-fiction, but also you showed them this novel, it deals with a lot of the aspects of loneliness and solitude, so it's a relevant non-fiction code. Let me use two of those bits of information to help find other books. So I said that was translated fiction, so I could look in my fiction in translation section. But also I said part of the action took place in Helsinki. The core of the Helsinki code is Finland. So show me some other books that take place in Finland. And I found this one. This one happens to be a classic. It's a classic in Finland. It happens to be talking about the period of the Second World War, but also it happens to be talking about a very, very specific named period that's really important for Finland. It's called the Winter War and the Continuation War. So there's a national extension for that, so that we know it's specifically about that. Now, if you're receiving this data and that's too detailed for you, obviously you can go back to the core of that code, which is the period of World War II. You might also look in other data and say, oh, it's also translated from Finnish. So I could, if I've got a section about literature about Finland, but also literature translated from Finnish, I could find that. So as before, I could perhaps put that in my Scandinavian fiction section, or maybe I'll have a fiction from Finland section, or maybe I'll have a section on war, or maybe I'll go back to my translated fiction section. But what else will I find in translated fiction? It's a way of linking a lot of different titles together. So I could find this one, fiction in translation. Now this one, the action takes place in the Ukraine. And it takes place in the last decade. Those two qualifiers, really, really important bits of information. If the publisher had added that information to the metadata they exchange, that would allow anybody who's receiving that data, I'm looking for anything about the Ukraine. That could be fiction or non-fiction. So we have that qualifier. I just wanted to clarify as well, which I forgot to mention in the beginning, all these classifications are just, I've added these for the purpose of this presentation. They do not necessarily represent how the publishers themselves have classified these books. So just to be clear, this is my ideas of classification. So we've got those qualifiers that would allow us to link across and to find other books that take place in the Ukraine or the early part of the last decade, or books that are in translation. And obviously we'd put it in the modern and contemporary fiction section again. And I just wanted to highlight another things that we have to sometimes do when we go from version to version is we're going to have to expand this by adding the words general and literary to FBA, even though the parent code is fiction, general and literary, just because the master version, as it were, not everybody understood that modern and contemporary fiction also relates to its parent. So we had to have this clarity back in for 1.5. Obviously, somebody who receives the data doesn't have to show the full breadcrumb like we do on the main subject. And again, that is in 1.5. And as Karina said, there will be a talk specifically about what's going on for the version 1.5 on April the 28th. And thank you. That's all from me. I'll hand you back to Karina. Thank you, everyone.
Great, thanks, Chris. You're handing me the screen, I believe, at some point. Any minute now.
Sorry.
That's all right. The joy of a live event.
Should have it now.
Okay. Let me just check that. Bear with me. There we go. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yep. Great. Okay, so just some observations there very quickly. Thanks, Chris, for that. Very whistle-stop tour through Thema. I think what stands out more than anything to me is the possibility for the depth and breadth of detail, and I'm really liking this the post coordination element of it, that it really, there's a lot more control. Should they want it, there's a lot more control for the publisher and the bookseller in terms of that post coordination, and the decision on, you know, how deep to go or how detailed to go is entirely with those organizations. And I think it lends itself really well to flexibility, to ownership, I guess, of your own lists and categories, etc., all within the structure of a standard. So yeah, so thank you. And just one observation I had as well. It was interesting looking at your figures on your early slides there. It was interesting to note that your national qualifiers and extensions, there's more of those than there are actual core subject categories, which I guess is the reason that the scheme is so adaptable and flexible and usable to some extent. Well, yeah. Endless possibilities. So thank you for that. I do have some questions, but we'll leave those till the end of the session and we can come back to the questions later on. So thank you once again. And I am now going to hand over to Marisa Davis. Marisa is Metadata Manager at Pan Macmillan, and she's going to give us a publisher's perspective of Thema, including the experience of implementing it, benefits, worked examples, looking at genres, qualifiers and more, all of course focused on adult fiction. So over to you, Marisa. If you want me to change the slide, just say change the slide. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Karina. Hi, I'm Marisa Davies and I'm a data manager at Pan Macmillan, and yeah, I am here to give a publisher's perspective on Thema and in particular adult fiction. So if you could change the slides, Karina, I'll start. So in general, for publishers, getting our books into smaller relevant categories online means that it's competing against fewer titles and then for ranking better. So Thema helps us to do this by being more granular, more up-to-date, more intuitive, more flexible and sophisticated. Next slide. So some thoughts on the interactive browser, which we found to be very clear and simple. The helpful search bar has been great for kind of just putting in, like, for example, what Chris said, you could put in the word vampire and it gives you some options. The ellipsis clearly shows if the category has more detailed subcategories, and the asterisk has been really useful for giving detailed usage notes and also pointing towards other codes to use. Next slide. And of course, all the extra qualifiers that Chris was talking about, we use these a lot. They're really great for, well, most of our fiction books, but especially our literary fiction. These ones in particular, I've noted because we do use them a lot. So the place qualifiers are so much more detailed now. So for example, with BIC, we would just put in New York State, whereas now we can go as local as Harlem or Greenwich Village. The interest qualifiers, in particular for diversity, we found really useful. So you have things like Black and British, transgender, religious groups, as well as moments of the year, for example, Independent Women's Day or World Book Day. So we found that interest qualifiers are really, really useful to add to our titles. And of course, more detailed time qualifiers. So, for example, with BIC, we could have a range of between 1,000 or 1,500. But now we can go as detailed as 1455 and the War of the Roses. And also we've been using the style qualifiers, probably not as much, but they have also been really helpful, particularly styles like Gothic or Jazz or Bauhaus. Next slide, please. So in general for fiction codes, in addition to the general genre codes, we commonly use these new fiction thema codes that are not available as BIC fiction codes. In particular, biographical fiction, contemporary lifestyle fiction, family life fiction, and very much humorous fiction. We've been using these codes in addition to what we've had before with BIC. Next slide. And we love how much more granular these genre codes are. So for example, I've used crime and mystery fiction and our book Date with Deceit. So previously with BIC, we'd have just been able to use the FF crime and mystery fiction code. But with Thema, we can use, 4 of these. So amateur detectives, cozy mystery, humorous crime, and women's sleuths are all perfect for this book. So we can be more detailed, but of course, keeping appropriate fiction codes with our titles. Next slide. And Chris mentioned the narrative themes, which we have found really helpful, particularly for our literary fiction titles. So where we've had books which originally with BIC, we'd have just had, FA and with, modern contemporary fiction. With Thema, we can add the modern and contemporary fiction codes, but all these narrative themes that are appropriate to our book. So for A Little Life, for example, we've used love and relationships, death, grief and loss, interior life, and identity and belonging. And with identity and belonging, as an example, it encourages you or advises that you could use an interest code where relevant. And here we've been able to add relating to gay people. So a great kind of use for literary fiction where we can use the narrative themes and the qualifiers to give our books kind of get more books into a category that originally it would have just been fiction, that kind of modern fiction. And next slide. But I didn't realise until I pasted the cover of this book that it matched perfectly in colour with the Thema, but it was also just the perfect book to represent how we've used fiction with non-fiction codes. So as Chris mentioned, that kind of flexibility has been really great. So for this book, as an example, Classic Dog Stories, we have used the main subject fiction code of classic fiction. We've also been able to use one of the special features fiction codes of short stories, but then because there is no animal fiction codes, we then used a non-fiction code with it to kind of give that extra detail. Of course, using the non-fiction code after all the fiction codes. So yeah, that flexibility with fiction and non-fiction has been really beneficial and useful to us. And next slide. And just to say that while it's not always easy to know how online retailers are using Thema to categorise, it is great to have as much information as possible to make sure the books go into the right place. For example, there is an Amazon browser guide which helps us for some, not all categories, but lets us know how to use the theme fiction codes with the qualifiers and some keywords to work together to get into certain categories online. Next slide. So implementing Thema at Pam Macmillan. First of all, we had to break the news to our editorial teams that there were more codes to add. They already add BIC and BIC, so obviously letting them know that there was going to be more work wasn't the great start, but they were given training, all the editors were given training to show how Thema worked and how to use it, and permissions to add Thema were not given to editorial until they attended one of those sessions. We also made it mandatory to add Thema for any new book. So yeah, a lot more work for the editors, but they were pleased to have those extra options and all the kind of possible extra codes that would benefit their books getting into categories. The main issues we found, similar to BIC, in that editors forget that they don't need the kind of parent code. For example, if they've got FFH, they don't need FF. That still happens with Thema as it used to happen with BIC too. And they also forget that they have so many qualifiers. There's obviously so many codes there that they can use now that sometimes they forget to look for them. And that's what, you know, the best data team do to remind them that they're there. I'd say the other issue is probably the visual similarity to BIC codes, which was obviously intentional and is great for people that know BIC to probably, you know, be able to understand Thema quicker. However, just as a kind of note, if you're adding it to your system, is we needed to make sure that people using our system could see that which one was a BIC code and which one was a Thema. So making sure that Thema was clear next to the code that they were using. And Pam Macmillan was slowly updating the backlist books, adding Thema manually. But we do have plans in place to automatically match the first bit to Thema for the rest of backlist, and that's something I'm sure other publishers are trying to do as quickly as they can. And that's me. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you for that. Again, it seems to be a recurring theme here. It's just the granularity, isn't it, really, of Thema and the flexibility that it can give. And interesting, if not possibly obvious, that there are some, you know, Thema codes that the equivalent is just not available anymore in the BIC code scheme. So, or not even, you know, perhaps not quite so appropriate anymore, given the length of time between the last update for the BIC codes and today. So, and interesting as well to see the use there of fiction with non-fiction, to give more detail in terms of the sort of the topic areas or the items, the subjects that are going to be covered off in the fiction title. And great as well that you can be specific with regards to, you know, place, interest, time, you know, all those narrative themes, to name just a few. So it must give some, it must be quite interesting to decide and make those decisions at a publishing level as to where you're going to put your book and how you're going to list it and how you're going to share that information. So thank you for that. I do have questions, but we'll save those till the end of the session. So moving on, I'm going to hand over to our two remaining speakers. So that will be Neela Ahrens and Dr. Detlef Bauer. So they are talking to us today from Libri, and they have the roles. They're responsible for looking after project management, metadata, and search. So they're going to talk to us today about how Thema can be implemented and used by booksellers to match both their needs and also their customer needs, with practical recommendations and worked examples as well. So all focused again on the adult fiction category. So over to you.
Hello, everybody. Welcome.
Hi.
We want to talk about how to make good use of Thema in a modern ERP system for small and medium-sized bookstores that we are just now right in the middle to develop. We have been starting to work on the new software in 2019, and by now we have about 300 customers using the software. As Marissa pointed out, the granularity of Thema is very appealing to people working in publishers and making metadata more rich and more suitable for the needs of the customers, which means for the end customers and for booksellers as well. So let's have a look on what we are talking about now for the next 20 minutes. So the next slide, please. In the first place, I want to give you a brief introduction of what Libri is and what we do. And then we have a first glance on Qimos, which is the new ERP system, as we say, for the 21st century. We have been providing software solutions for the independent booksellers and for bigger stores since the turn of the century. So for the last 22 years almost. Then we will have a look on Thema as a tool for faceted search. And then we will have a look at the Thema chain of terms, which have been quite long, and we had to curtail the hierarchical system of Thema chain of terms to make them work in an ERP system where you want to see the right information at one glance. Then we will talk about a new hierarchical structure we introduced in Thema. We made some slight changes to the original hierarchical structure. We developed together with our colleagues from different countries since 2013. So after that, we talk about customizing the Thema structure by flattening it and how to show more hits per topic in a plain structure, which is the result of flattening the structure. And then we show newly adapted fiction structure for Thema, in Qimos. Next slide, please. Libri is your partner for success in the European media market, to say it in one sentence. We have been founded in 1928, and since then we cater for the needs of booksellers and consumers looking for book and media products as well. So if you start up left, you see the end consumer, and he goes to his brick and mortar bookstore, or he visits his bookstore online to obtain books. And we help the bookstores with ERP systems, and we help also the bookstores with their online business by providing more than 1,000 customers with white label shop systems we have been developing for the last 18 years. So on the right side, you see just a brief glance on up right. This is Qimos, the new ERP system we offer, and on the bottom you see a screenshot of a white label shop of one of our customers. But that's not all we offer to the booksellers. We have an electronic ordering system and a clearing center. So we have the same function as Nielsen had in the British book market before they turned over to MBB this month. Beside that, we have a huge warehousing facility right in the middle of Germany, which is in Bad Hersfeld, where we can supply books to our customers within 12 hours. So if you order up to 6 o'clock in the afternoon, you will get your books on the next morning on the doorstep at about 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning. And besides that, we have now opened up a really huge printing facility also in Bad Hersfeld, where we can print 3.5 million titles, mostly English language content, more than 2.5 million, and German language content overnight. So if you order in our print-on-demand facility up to maybe 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you'll also receive your freshly printed copy next morning. Besides that, we not only deliver through our own delivery service, which is called Bookspress, our carrier, to the booksellers, We also do direct mail, so all the end consumers ordering through white label bookstores or affiliated dealers bookstores, we also do the logistics and supply them with the books they are looking for. Next slide, please. Here we have a first glance at the new ERP system we created, which is named QUIMOS, which stands for we can do, we can find, we can give you a solution for all your needs. And in that respect, we did in our former ERP systems in 2016 and 17 incorporate all the Thema subject codes and qualifiers in the search indices. So you have been able to search for all the topics given in Thema now for the last 6 to 7 years. So the booksellers were quite used to that. But besides that, we also wanted to offer them a more structured way of observing what Thema can do for them. So we invented a filtered or faceted search based on the Thema categories, and that you can see on the left side of the slide where I have written Thema over it. And the filtered search is also, you can use different faceted filter options. You can look for product form, you can look for the age of a target group, you can look for a language, you can look for certain authors, and you can look for all the Thema topics with all your hits you created by just entering your search words. So in the example, you see Harry Potter, and then you can see the selected Thema code, which is the F Thema code for fiction. Then you can see how all the other products that you found with your hit are grouped within the Thema category. We will display all hits of a Thema code always in the highest hierarchy level. So you will have in fiction, you will have all the hits you created by just entering Harry Potter. And if you drill down, you'll find the smaller groups of titles assigned to a special subject code. Next slide, please. In that respect, we had to do some adjustments to the Thema and to the hierarchical structure of Thema. As a search result, you will notice all Thema categories with hits of your search words. And in the drill down menu, you can choose easily from those categories. And you see this here a little bit better. The number of hits in the categories are displayed, and the hierarchy of Thema is displayed by indentation. So our task was the hierarchical Thema chain of incredibly long terms had to be curtailed to an easy understandable way. And we did this by following the proposals of the Norwegian Thema group for curtailing Thema and apply the rules for all the 3,114 Thema topics we have now in the version 1.4 that is in use. And that task was done by Nele, who is also today with us, and she has also been providing all those slides I'm just talking about now. So we can go over to the next slide to show you how long the Thema category was in the past. So we had a category like something out of educational books, textbooks, Schule und Lernen, moderne Nicht-Mutter- oder Zweitsprachen, Fremdsprachenerwerb, Grammatik, Wortschatz und Aussprache, which has a length of 122 characters. And you can't display that easily in an ERP system. So what we did by grouping the hierarchy in indentions, you can shorten it almost to the last part of the chain, which results in the first line that I just quoted in Grammatik, Wortschatz und Aussprache. So we were able almost to shorten a maximum of 122 characters to 39 characters. The task of Nelo was to shorten it to 40 characters, and the longest term we created in the end was 39 characters, and that was easily to display on the left side of the ERP system on a white screen. Please, the next slide. Besides that, we also had very vivid discussions with our customers using the software that the hierarchical structure of Thema that we inherited from BIC was not always suitable to the needs of the German book market, at least. What you can see here is that you did not find travel books on first glance, because travel and holiday guides are part of lifestyle, hobbies, and leisure. It was not easy for our booksellers to get used to it, that they have to look in a filter facet that's called lifestyle to find travelable books. So what we did, we displayed those really dearly needed topics on a higher level in the hierarchy. So travel, holiday guides, cooking, eating have been taken from lifestyle, hobbies, and leisure, and we display them now at first glance. So if you enter something like Ukraine, you will see all books concerning the topic, and you will see quite a huge amount of travel guides just by the first glance. The same we had to do with educational material, because educational material is part of children's teenage and educational, but textbooks are such an eminent group of books for our dealers, so that we have to display them on first glance. So we put them as standalone. For small and medium-sized dealers, this is important, and the frequently used categories are no longer hidden. Maybe we will have some discussions in the national and international groups whether we could do sometime adjustments to that topics that are not well to be discovered in the structure we have now. Next slide, please. And then we had also to customize the TML structure by flattening it, because by now we have 3,100, more than 3,100 subject codes in the Thema classification, which has the appeal to publishers that it's very granular, and you can tell the customer in a very specific way what a book is about. On the other hand, if you are looking for more orientation in a shop system, whether it will be a brick and mortar shop or an online shop, the structure we have developed now is too complicated to convey it, at least to the end consumer. Booksellers are to some extent able to work with all those categories, but the end consumer definitely is not. So what we did, we wrote up categories not so frequently used in the German market and mapped them to broader sections higher up in the hierarchy. So granular terms disappeared in the faceted search option and are subsumed by broader ones. But, and that's the good news for publishers, in the search index, all granular terms are still capped for the search result. the search query is still showing the suitable hits. So if you look, for instance, in keywords for Napoleonic War or for fiction, and you will enter maybe Vietnam, you will get all the hits that you have under FGMV in the display, and you will find everything. But to structure all the books you have in your store, we found it not necessary to display Vietnam War fiction, Second World War fiction, or Napoleonic War fiction in the faceted search option. Such a compact version of Thema leads to less subject categories, which is clear, in the faceted search option, and leads to better discoverability of bread and butter topics of small bookstores or medium-sized bookstores. You still have to keep in mind that the customer base Libri is catering for is about 4,000 bookshops in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland alone. So we have much more small and medium-sized bookstores than you have in the UK or even in the US. Next slide, please. So here you can see again how to show more hits per topic in a planar structure. You will only have, if you look for instance, for a search word like Napoleon, you will have war, fiction, war in the faceted search, and you will find all the titles that are in any connection with Napoleonic Wars in that category. Next slide, please. So the newly adopted fiction structure in Thema for creamers here, for instance, in crime and mystery fiction, what were 105 categories in the Thema version 1.4 for fiction have now been reduced to 90 categories in our adapted version. And as I said, Napoleonic War fiction, Vietnam War fiction were rolled up because they are not as frequently used in the German market as they are in the UK or US market. So we have a little bit more clarity in the structure, and the booksellers are liking it. That's from me for now. Thank you, and open for discussion.
Great, thank you. It's interesting to see how the complexity of Thema has been adapted, not within Thema, but that you're adapting your systems to make the scheme, or to make the Thema scheme market or territory specific. So to use or to show those areas that are relevant for your markets and for your customers.
I think that's vital to stress again. No information that we get from our publishers is really lost. The information is retained. Yeah, exactly. But I think it's important to say that, you know, the standards are here, which Thema is a standard. Standards are in the industry to help the industry. They're not there to make life more difficult. And I think you've demonstrated there, Detlef, that it is a very flexible standard, and the systems that not just yourself but other stakeholders will have in the industry can be adapted to make that standard work for that territory or that region or country, if you like. Thank you very much. So that now takes us to our Q&A session. So just a reminder, if you're attending, you won't be able to verbally ask the question should you have any, but if you do have any, please put them into the question box and we will have a look at so I'm just checking the question box now. I can't see any questions, so let's, and I'm just
changing the screen. Bear with me a second. So if I can just invite everyone to put their cameras back on, including myself. Find the button, there we go. So I haven't got any questions yet. Maybe people are thinking about it. So I have just while people are thinking about it or perhaps typing away, I've got a few questions here. So Chris, could you talk, we've heard mention of a few countries in the various presentations and how different countries are using the scheme. Could you talk a little bit about the governance of the scheme? So how that all knits together, given that it's an international scheme, how does it all work? How do people contribute and give their thoughts and views about categories and qualifiers, etc., etc.?
Yes, so Thema, like all the standards that EDItEUR manages, has a governance structure, and that governance structure is made up as Detlef alluded to. There are national groups representing the book industries in particular countries or in particular linguistic markets. So for example, the United Kingdom has one that's facilitated through BIC, and so those people get together and discuss issues that may come up in their own markets, from publishing, retailing, or other parts of the industry, and they will look at those proposals and then submit them to EDItEUR, or when we get proposals, we will send them out to those national groups for them to discuss. We also receive proposals and ideas and questions from member organizations, or from publishers or retailers who are implementing the system and simply get in touch with us. So we receive ideas, thoughts about improvements to Thema, to Onyx from all different parts of the global book sector, but we don't add anything to any of our standards without the explicit consent of our national groups, who get together twice a year at the London Book Fair and the Frankfurt Book Fair to approve any changes. For Thema, we only do changes every 2 years because there's a whole review process and it takes time when we're talking about subject classification. So we tend to do that every 2 years. So the next one will be 1.5, which is due for approval the week of the London Book Fair, and then publication at the end of April of this year. And then there won't be an update on that Thema till 2024 will be the next one.
Okay.
To answer your question, Karina. So of course, if you're a British publisher, retailer, and you're interested in discussing Thema, get in touch with BIC and their Thema group, or directly with EDItEUR.
Yeah, and our Thema national group meets every quarter. You know, as Chris said, if you are based in the UK and you do want to take part in that, just get in touch. We have had a question in. Look at my bigger screen because my eyes aren't what they were. What are the various categories of qualifiers? Or are there too many to list? Can you group them?
Yes. You have place qualifiers. They start with 1. So this book is about this place, or the action of this novel takes place here. You have number 2, language qualifiers. This book is about this language. 3 is time periods. So this is a book about this period of time, history of art, this period, history of drama, or the action of my novel takes place in this period. 4 is educational purpose qualifiers. So this is a book for secondary education, primary education. This is a book specific for use in Wales for the Welsh curriculum, etc. 5 are interest qualifiers. 2 main things. There's a whole set of age qualifiers which you use with the Y codes, which are children's and teenage fiction. So you can say this is for a 4-year-old, this is for a 16-year-old. And then there are various interest codes that Marissa showed some of them in her presentation. And then 6 is style qualifiers, styles so that you can use with art, architecture, music, poetry, plays, etc. to say, this is a book about Gothic architecture, Gothic art, Gothic music, etc.
Great.
Does that, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, very comprehensive, thank you. And I think it's also worth mentioning as well that Thema is free to use for everyone, so you can just download the whole lot and implement it into your system, so there is no fee for that. And all the resources that are available on both the BIC website and the EDItEUR website are also free to use for anyone. You don't have to be members of BIC or EDItEUR to access those. So just checking if there's any more questions. Not at the moment. So my next question then is, let's give Chris a chance to catch his breath. Detlef, can bookshops choose their own categories that are displayed on their sites? For example, if they're a specialised bookshop, say, that only sells fiction and literature, can they opt out of displaying some sections?
In our white label shop system, we have, as I said, more than 1,000 dealers using the white label shop systems, and most of them are small and medium-sized bookshops. So the bigger participants in the German market, they create their own bookstores and online stores and have their own category trees. Most of them are until now not using Thema, which is a pity, I'd say. But as Marissa just said, with Amazon, you can find at least some sections that are now powered by Thema categories. So we did for our booksellers at the moment only one solution. You have not the option to, for instance, choose a different category tree if you are just catering to special needs like LGBTQ customers, for instance, that you only have special sections in the white label shops. We are in discussions with our booksellers, and I feel that we will have much more use for individualization in the next years to come. But for the time being, we only have one white label shop system for all.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Marissa, as a publisher, if I'm a small independent publisher and I'm using BIC codes and I want to migrate to the Thema codes, what do you think? What would be your sort of top three, or where would you start? How would you advise that small publisher or even a medium-sized publisher to start?
I guess the first thing would be to get online and use that interactive browser. It's just worth spending a bit of time going through everything, seeing what comes up when you search for certain words, or just, you know, opening up the different categories and seeing what different subjects, you know, are in the hierarchy. With our editors who are new to Thema, that's what we always ask them to do, just almost have a play with it and see what's there. If you're looking to put it into your system, we use Biblio, and when we first put it into our system, there was nothing that differentiated the BIC and the Thema codes. So while a lot of the BIC and Thema codes are similar, there are some that use completely different letters. So there was a bit of confusion. Yeah. So it's very something to note is that you will need something in your system that separates the two just by having the word BIC or Thema in the search tool or whatever tool that's used into your system. And also just to kind of have a think about how you will look at backlist and how you will be able to update your backlist to make sure that your books have Thema, not just for books going forward, but all the books that you already have available. And that does take time. So it's about thinking how to manage that, because at the moment that's someone putting someone putting those codes in manually. And then if you're having editors, if your publisher, depends how your publisher works, but at ours, our editors put in the Thema codes, and it's just about taking them through everything and training them, not just on how to input it, but also on the benefits. They're having to do this extra work, so it's worth taking the time to show them why they're doing that extra work and how it will improve discoverability and therefore help the readers find their books.
Yeah, brilliant advice, thank you. And who should I ask this to? Chris, or maybe Detlef, or three or four of you. Do you? What's your sense of how? If we think about the UK and Germany, I guess, because that's where our speakers are from today. In terms of adoption by booksellers, how do you? Is it being widely adopted? Can booksellers receive that information into their systems? What's your sense of, other than Amazon, of course, which we know is using Thema? How's that adoption progressing?
Detlef, you go first.
I think the progress we are making now in Germany is quite good, because all the booksellers by now know how to use Thema, and as we have been using Thema for now almost 8-9 years, we have very good data from our publishers usually. We have the smaller publishers that are still lagging behind a little bit, but the big publishing houses are all contributing very, very high quality metadata. And so in the search indices, by now you find titles and you can look for special information that you would not have been able to find 5 or 6 years ago. The classical information, for instance, is if you are looking for special fiction of a place you want to go to for travel, you enter now Yorkshire and just the search engine, and you get dozens of fiction titles on Yorkshire by now. 5 years ago, you might have found some maps and that's it. So the quality improved a lot. And now by getting all those booksellers used also to use filter facets based on Thema, I think we are on the right track to really get Thema deeply implanted in our systems. And our old keyword systems by now have been are not so visible anymore in the systems, and the people are using now the Thema subject categories to find titles. Sorry, Chris.
That's okay.
I would say that the UK market is very similar to the German market in that the big publishing groups are doing a very good job on sending Thema, good metadata. A lot of smaller and medium-sized publishers are also doing that now, but there's still a lag. So all the big central, the BDS, Nielsen, Gardner's, they can all take Thema codes, and they will all make those codes available to their onward customers. But if there is no Thema code supplied, then they can't pass it on. So there's a lag in the, maybe like with Germany, smaller publishers, or getting backlists done. So that needs to be done. The big online platforms are all making use of Thema now to a greater or lesser extent, because it's international. So they then have to only ask for one set of codes, which they may then map to different topics or subjects in different markets, Or, for example, Kobo now displays Thema codes. They're clickable. If you don't have a Thema code, you don't have that option to search. So if if you're a publisher and you don't put Thema codes, then Kobo just doesn't expose them, and you reduce the discoverability of your titles. Because most of the big data providers do include Thema codes, they will give those to retailers, and the retailers can make use of them as they choose. So I think the importance is for publishers to make sure they have at least added a top level and then started looking at the detail. If a retailer wants to make a choice about creating a fiction in translation section, or a Scandinavian fiction section, or an LGBT section, if that information is not easily available, then it becomes harder. So the job of people like what Libri does to create sites, if the information isn't there from the publishers, then can't make the most of it for the retailers, because booksellers know what they're doing. Booksellers are very good at hand selling and and finding books and creating curated lists. But the more information they have available, the more information they can expose to the customers, the better it is. So need to encourage publishers to make better, sort of medium and smaller publishers.
So would you say then, Chris, it's advisable for publishers to more information is better? So when in doubt, add more.
I have to be careful what I say. Good information, good relevant information.
Good relevant information.
Because if I want to look for Ukraine fiction set in the Ukraine, I don't want you to show me every single book that's been published about. I don't want to see a romance novel set in the west of the United States of America. I only want to see the relevant stuff. So there's no point misusing it. Subject codes are really important. It's worth spending time on them. Far better to spend time on choosing good set of subject codes and qualifiers than stuffing adjectives into a meaningless headline kind of thing. There are better ways of doing it. So yeah, don't overdo the subject codes. Subject codes aren't a list of keywords. They're a specific set. So if you're finding you're adding too many subject codes to every single title, you're probably not using them to the best.
We have about 1 to 2% of the titles that have more than 50 subject codes assigned to them, up to 100, and that doesn't make sense.
Wow.
So look at the notes if you assign topics, and look at the handouts that the national groups are providing. We advise about 5 subject codes per title and or more, but sometimes you even have 100. That's not very helpful, because every one of us will know no book we know, not even the Encyclopedia Britannica, will cater for 100 topics. That may be the Encyclopedia Britannica will.
Yeah, that's a very good example. Encyclopedia Britannica, there's one code for encyclopedias. That's a perfect code. You don't need 100. I think what Detlef said about the five subject codes is a good guideline. It's a good sort of criteria to set. We shouldn't be set 5 subject codes. You could apply that to types of qualifiers, because, for example, if you look at fiction aimed at teenagers or middle grade readers, quite often there's a lot of qualifiers, especially in the 5s. You might want to put 5 qualifiers there. So 5 is a good guideline. Question things if you're adding systematically more than 5, or you've added more than 5 to several titles. Why am I using so many subject codes? So.
It's absolutely something that we advise when we're training on Thema to new editors as well, because if you're adding something that isn't appropriate, it's not just bad metadata, it's also detrimental to that book in algorithms. It's not, if someone's coming across that book by mistake, they're not clicking on it, they're not going through to it, they're not buying it, so it's not good for our book. So yeah, absolutely agree with just keeping it as relevant as possible.
Okay, Chris, how do you establish if a category, subject category, is even required? How do they come about?
So new subject categories, one of the things we try and do is we try and look, are there really books about this topic? Before we even think about putting it through to the working group that's created, are there really books about the subject? Are there books about this subject in different markets? So this is where our national groups are very useful, why we send out the suggestions to them, because they can often look up and say, actually, no, this is really important in the Brazilian market, or this is really important in Australia or Canada. But also can get feedback saying, no, we haven't got nobody's publishing books about this. So we do a lot of research. Means my browse histories can be very interesting, and my suggested next purchases becomes very interesting. And then we make a short list or a medium-sized list of the proposed additions, and then we create a working group. With that working group, we try and make sure we have people from different sectors of the industry and from different national groups, so we can get very different perspectives, and we discuss them. And if we're not sure, if we don't think there's enough, or we think actually you can create this sense by putting that code and that code together, or that code and that qualifier, we try and reject it. and we then say, right, actually this could probably go into the note for this code just to give further guidance. So we try and only choose things where there's a significant publication or significant need to call out certain topics. And those topics also should be persistent topics, not fad topics. So something that sort of currently is, lots of people are looking for that term and classifying things under, calling it that. We won't add, I used the example of cottagecore, which was trending in English for a lot of different things, and people are now starting to publish books, but we won't consider that as a subject category until, first of all, a group or a member suggests we add cottagecore, and then we'll look at it, is this just a trending term? Or is it something that is going to be useful in the book trade in the future? Because we always have several codes. In the W section, for example, there are lots of codes about crafts and things, and that would be suitable for cottagecore books. We have the cozy sections in fiction that often correspond to cottagecore. So in some ways, it's just another way of saying the same thing.
Hygge in Denmark.
Yes, for example.
Yes.
But that was a good example, because we have a Danish group, so we said, what do you think about this? And they'll give us feedback and say, well, not really worth adding that as a concept to Thema.
Right, and then add it in the Danish translation. You can add it in the code so that you can find it easily.
Yep,
that works.
Okay.
So we will have legal tech, for instance, in the next version, I suppose, because legal tech is now something that's widely used in legal professions. And that's not only a trend, but that's something of technical means that changes the trade of or the business of legal professionals. And we have hundreds of books now on that topic. So we have to have that topic in our browse tree as well.
Yep, and that is one of the new additions.
Okay,
which is due to come out when, Chris?
End of April. The final meeting, the meetings are happening in April. If they agreed, then we will add them. For example, we're adding some narrative themes. There's a narrative theme around health and illness, a narrative theme around diversity, equality, and inclusion. We're adding serial killers in thrillers. And also the concept in the special features of novella, because in some markets it's really important to be able to distinguish short stories, novellas, and well, everything else is full fiction.
Yeah.
So, and that was something that is not used in some markets, but in some markets it's really important. So those are some of the things in the fiction.
Got another question, and I'm going to roll it into one that I had as well. Is how many countries are using Thema currently? Do you know? And is Thema used by US publishers?
We have 26 language translations. We have representative groups. So, for example, Detlef is part of the German language group, which represents Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. So it's hard, for example, sometimes to quantify how many countries. We have one single group that represents Spanish-speaking Latin America and the Caribbean, a separate group for Brazil, because they represent several countries. It's also free, standard, and open for anybody to use. We have had questions from Indonesia, from Trinidad and Tobago, so somebody is using it somewhere. But we have no way of actually knowing every single country that's used. Is it used in the US? More and more, because the United States, there are lots of publishers in the United States that are aware that it's important that if they're trading with other countries, they include information. Thema is becoming more important in Canada because there's far more codes that are relevant for Canada. So some US publishers are using it. If you work extensively with the United States of America, some of the big organizations, you will have to carry on using BIC, which is specifically designed for the USA and is very strongly implanted in the United States. But more and more people are using Thema in the US, yes.
And we have to say that by growing Thema in the last 6-7 years, a mapping of Thema and BIC is very easy to do now.
Okay, thank you. Question for Dr. Bauer. Dr. Bauer, can you talk a little bit about your experience with the qualifiers? How are qualifiers used and displayed? So that's a question from the audience.
Yeah, the qualifiers are still in search options, not so visible as we like to have them. We have some really special cases in the German market where we are heavily relying on qualifiers, and that's school textbooks. Because in the German system, you don't have a centralized system for the country, but you have 16 states within Germany, and they decide which textbooks in what form are used in their relevant state. So with every textbook, we need to have a geographical qualifier concerning the state where the textbooks can be used. Then you have, and that depends on the state, different school types. You have up to 42 school types in Germany. So you have to convey also the school type with the textbook. And then you have to convey the topic of the book, or in which for which educational purpose you are using the book. And that's the third qualifier. So if you look at a faceted search for textbooks, you have a very complicated structure, and we are using 3 different types of qualifiers for making those titles more transparent to the consumer. Besides that, you need desperately qualifiers with travel books, because the travel section is very clear and consistent in Thema, but you always have to add a geographic qualifier, otherwise it doesn't make sense. But that's mostly done over the search indices, because usually people looking for travel books, they add the country they are looking for while entering the search words. Language qualifier is a little bit tricky, because the language qualifier is reserved for linguistic titles. So if you really have written a book on the German language and the use of the German language, you could add a qualifier, language qualifier, but some publishers confuse that with the language of text. I hope that helps.
I'm sure it does. It's quite strange not being able to have that interaction with the audience, isn't it? It's just through a question box. Okay, thank you. I'm looking at the clock, and I think we are pretty much out of time. I think we should close the session. So I can't see any more questions coming through. I'll just have one final whiz through the question box. No, just something to mention as well before I forget, that there is a ready-made mapping procedure from old BIC to Thema, which some publishers and booksellers might find useful for backlists. So I believe, Chris, that's on the EDItEUR website, is that right?
It is on the Thema page. You'll find the mappings, BIC to Thema, Thema to BIC, and also a public version of BIC to Thema.
Yeah. Okay.
And also there's a mapping of the old German scheme as well.
Yes, Warengruppe.
Okay, lovely, thank you. So I'm going to bring us to the end of the session then, since we're out of time, right on the nose. So let me just share my screen one last time and just let everybody know that we're going to make the presentation, the slides for today, available to all the attendees. We'll put them on our website as well for those that weren't able to attend today. And there'll be a recording of the whole session on our YouTube channel, but just give us a few days to get that ready and get that out. So that will probably be towards the sort of beginning to middle of next week. If you want to stay up to date with BIC's work and our events, do sign up to our mailing list. The list is the link is on the screen there. And in the meantime, before you all go, I would like to point you to 2 very helpful short documents on Thema. So there's a series of documents on BIC's website called BIC Bites. They're very short, 2 sides of A4, papers of specific topics pertinent to the book industry supply chain. So BIC Bite number 14 is a general introduction to Thema, and BIC Bite number 15 is an introduction to Thema specifically for booksellers. So they're free to download and available to everyone, available to all. You don't have to be a member. So finally, I would like to take this opportunity to say a huge thank you to our speakers today on behalf of BIC and on behalf of everyone attending. So thank you to Chris, Marisa, Neela and Detlef for taking the time out to talk to us today, but not just for that, but for the time they put in as well, preparing the slides and going through the rehearsals and the practices and liaising with each other to make sure that we get the content right for you. To our attendees, I'd like to say thank you for joining us. Please do stay in touch, and you can find out more about what BIC does on our website. And we hope to see you at another BIC event in the near future. And we'll be at London Book Fair as well for those of you who are attending. So hopefully we will see some of you there as well. So take care until then. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.